All right, so in this video, we're going to kind of go over I guess we'll call it the background and the context for the French Revolution. So this is the immediate stuff that you need to understand what's about to happen in 1789. So we'll just jump in. Despite the fact that the Enlightenment is kind of centered in Paris, France itself is still really aristocratic and in many ways carries on a lot of medieval and feudal traditions. So even though there are all these ideas about equality and limited government, France is still being run as an absolute monarchy. So the first thing we've got to understand about why the French Revolution happens is in the social structure. And this is known as the Three Estates. We've discussed this before, but I think we need to give it the detail it deserves now, particularly the detail in France. So there were these three estates, or classes, of people, and this goes back to the medieval conception of society, where you have those who pray, which are the clergy, those who fight, who are the nobility, and those who work, which is everyone else. So the first estate is the clergy. And I'll give you some basic statistics for each class as well. So collectively, of the roughly 30 million people who lived in France at the time, there were about 100,000 members of the clergy. That's it. And they collectively owned somewhere between 5 and 10% of the land. So the church owned about somewhere between 5 and 10% of the land, and there's about 100,000 clergy, which comes out to be less than 1% of the total population. But within the clergy, there is a wide disparity between clergy members, because there are some clergy members that are super rich, and there are some that are basically living in poverty. So there are some clergy members that are super rich and influential, and then there are some that basically live like a poor regular person. The only difference between these guys and the third estate who we'll get to in a moment, is that these guys don't pay taxes. They don't pay taxes, and it was kind of the only avenue for kind of second or third sons of nobility to get ahead. So you could be like the third son of a rich noble. You wouldn't be able to inherit the noble estate, but you could still get ahead as a rich member of the clergy. Okay, the second estate is the nobility. Now, for these guys, roughly 400 to 500,000 people. And these guys owned roughly about, we'll say 30 to 40% of the land. So, somewhere in the realm of like 2%, 3% of the population, and they own roughly about a third of the land in France. A couple of points we need to make about the nobility. These guys also don't pay taxes. And their not paying taxes it's a social thing. Like, it's a sign that you are a noble. So there is kind of a stigma associated to paying taxes. That if you have to pay taxes, that means that you're a commoner. And so as people bought noble titles, they resisted the need to pay taxes because of the social stigma. If you were a noble, you didn't pay taxes. Now, another point that needs to be made is that after Louis XIV, who pretty masterfully kind of held the nobility in check, after Louis XIV, the nobility starts to make a comeback. Kind of exerting their power in the Parlement. The Parlement were these regional appeals courts. That was the noble base of power. Now, before we leave these guys entirely, I need to make one point maybe a little bit more clear. In that when we say that they don't pay taxes, they don't pay like income tax. They still pay like the equivalent of what we would call a sales tax. So when they buy things, they still pay taxes on that. But they don't pay what we would consider like an income or a property tax. That's what they don't pay. So they still do pay some taxes. But when it comes to like the big taxes that need to be paid to like run the government or fund a war, these guys don't pay that. Okay, so that brings us to the third estate. And the third estate is everyone else. So we'll say, depending on when we're looking at this, kind of right before the French Revolution, we'll say it's about 25 million people. And what's left? Oh, somewhere in the range of maybe 45 to 55% of the land. So this is roughly about 95+% of the population. And they own roughly about half of the land. Now, because this is, basically everyone else in France, this is a super diverse group. So this brings together the richest merchants and the poorest peasants. We've got very well-educated scholars and lawyers, and we've got uneducated workers. So we've basically every type of person is represented within the third estate. And because of that, it's really hard to make general statements about this group. So the richest people tried their best to buy noble titles and thus become a member of the second estate. So the richest people tried not to remain in the third estate. If you could get out of the third estate, you did. Which leaves kind of this group to be the most vocal members of this group aren't the richest people, but the most educated. And they're the ones who are going to be spouting Enlightenment ideas. So these are the guys that are going to be making the most noise when the revolution starts. A lot of these people also negotiated tax benefits because they could. They could argue for it. So if we think about the other half of this group, the poorest group of people, this is where all of the tax burden falls. So these are the people that were forced to pay an unfair share of taxes. Because they couldn't argue their way out of it. They didn't have the traditional non-payment of taxes, so they had to pay all of the taxes. They couldn't get out of it. On top of this, wage earners were hurt the worst. So I've seen a statistic that says from the 1730s to the 1780s, wages rose 22%, while prices for stuff, consumer prices, rose 65%. Now, most of these people weren't wage earners. They sold their stuff directly to markets. But, I mean, the idea here is that costs are going up and the money is staying still. So basically, for these people, costs are going up and wages and prices are kind of going down. And this is the situation we find ourselves in when we get into the 1780s. Now, there's one more point that I want to make before we start getting into the actual chronology of the revolution, and that's this. So, as more people join the nobility, buying their title, they started to demand their taxes and fees and dues that are owed to the person who owns the title. Now, most of these taxes were forgotten about. Most of these were forgotten, and I guess they weren't asked for. But remember, if you bought your office, if you bought your title, it was a financial thing. It was an investment. So you did this to make money. You didn't do it because you wanted to have a noble title. You didn't do it because you wanted the responsibility of being a noble. You did it because you wanted to make money. And as you can imagine, all of this causes a lot of resentment towards the nobility. Like, these people aren't providing a service. They're not protecting you. They're not maintaining anything on your land. They're just collecting money. And if you're giving them money for absolutely no purpose, of course you're going to get mad at them. One more background point before we start jumping into the financial crisis. Public opinion is now a thing. Now, remember, absolute monarchs don't care. Public opinion doesn't matter to an absolute monarch. But as more people become literate, let's just say that the third estate vastly outnumbers everybody else. Dot, dot, dot. People are well aware that there are all these lazy nobles who are just collecting a paycheck. People are aware that the poorest people are being forced to pay an unfair amount of taxes. People are aware that there are all sorts of corrupt clergy members that are living a life that is not what Jesus would want you to live. And they're being written about in newspapers and pamphlets every single day. And the people are just getting madder and madder and madder. So, finally, let's get into the actual events. So what happens to spark this off? So we jump all the way up to the financial crisis of 1788. It comes to light and it becomes public knowledge that France is broke. France is broke. The loss of the 7 Years' War and funding the American Revolution without getting any financial benefit. Because remember, the point of the American Revolution was twofold. On one hand, they wanted to psychologically damage the British. And they did. I mean, the British felt kind of ashamed losing the American colonies. But they quickly got over that. The real benefit to funding the Americans was that they would replace the British as their trading partner with the French. That was the benefit. That was what they wanted to get. But the Americans signed a separate treaty with the British, continuing their trade relationship and leaving the French out in the cold. So they spent all this money liberating the Americans, and they got nothing to show for it other than giving the British a black eye. So basically, France was broke. They lost the 7 Years' War, which cost them a lot of money. They won the American Revolution, but didn't get anything for it. And this is on top of a financial policy called useful grandeur. That's what it's called. Useful grandeur. So basically what useful grandeur was that throughout the 1770s, France was in financial trouble. Like, everyone could see it. All the people who had the books could see it. They could see that France was in financial trouble. But they just kept spending like they weren't. And the point of that was to continue to get loans. Which is a really dumb thing to do. But they use this facade to show that everything was fine when everything was not fine, in order to get more loans to just float them along for another year. And eventually, all of this came crashing down in 1788. Eventually, the loans just became untenable, and the French had to say, we're broke. We need to fix this. So, Louis and his ministers put forward a plan to raise taxes on everyone. Everyone's now got to pay their fair share. Everyone has to pay their fair share. This was blocked by the Parlement, especially the Parlement of Paris. So the nobles argue, maybe rightly so, that any new tax has to be approved by the Estates General. Now, the Estates General is a meeting of the estates. It's kind of like a parliament, but not really. The last time a Estates General was called was 1614. I think that was during the reign of Henry IV. So only the Estates General could make any changes to the tax system. And so Louis XVI, agrees to call the Estates General, and they are going to meet in May of 1789. And we'll pick our story up in May of 1789 because almost from the get-go, the Estates General goes completely off the rails, and Louis loses almost complete control of the Estates General right from day one. So we'll pick the story up there, and until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.